Moving into our new home in the quiet suburbs felt like the beginning of a dream. My wife, Alice, and I had spent months searching for the perfect place, and now here we were. A charming two-story house with a white picket fence, wide windows that caught the morning light, and a backyard big enough to host barbecues with friends we'd hoped to make. It was supposed to mark a new chapter in our lives, something brighter, happier, and free of the stress that had clung to us in the city. Alice was radiant that day, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail, her laughter filling every empty room as we carried in boxes. She teased me about my lack of organizational skills, while I pretended to be offended, laughing along. These were the moments I lived for, her playful banter, her warmth. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking, decorating, and introducing ourselves to the neighbors. Everyone seemed friendly enough. There was the retired couple next door who offered us pie, the young family across the street with twin boys, and then there were Todd and Sarah. Todd and Sarah were the kind of couple who made you notice them. Todd had a rugged, confident charm with his easy grin and broad shoulders, while Sarah was strikingly beautiful, with a sharp wit that made conversations both fascinating and slightly intimidating. They invited us over for drinks one evening, and we gladly accepted, eager to connect with people in our new community. That night was pleasant enough at first. We chatted about the neighborhood, shared laughs over some wine, and even discussed our plans for the house. But as the evening wore on, their demeanor shifted. Sarah leaned in a little closer to Alice, her laughter a bit too intimate. Todd's gaze lingered on me in a way that made me uncomfortable. Then came the bombshell. They casually mentioned they were swingers. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. I glanced at Alice, expecting shock or awkward laughter. Instead, she smiled. Just a small, polite smile, but it was enough to unsettle me. I chuckled nervously, brushing off the revelation as a joke. But Todd and Sarah assured us they were quite serious. When we left their house that night, I could feel the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air between Alice and me. I convinced myself it was just an odd moment, nothing more. After all, we had moved here for a fresh start. Little did I know, that evening was the first crack in the foundation of our seemingly perfect life. In the days following that dinner, the memory of Todd and Sarah's confession lingered like an itch I couldn't scratch. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on settling into our new home. But Alice seemed unusually quiet, her thoughts often far away. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of the move. Moving is hard, I reminded myself. People need time to adjust. But one evening, as we were unpacking books in the living room, Alice broke the silence. "What do you think about Todd and Sarah?" she asked, her voice casual, almost too casual. I glanced up from the box I was rummaging through. "They're interesting," I said, trying to match her tone. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment before she continued. "I mean, about what they said. About their lifestyle." My stomach tightened. I put the book in my hand down, suddenly unable to focus on anything but her face. "Why are you asking?" She shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "I'm just curious. It's different, you know? Not something you hear every day." The way she said it, so neutral, so nonchalant, made my skin crawl. I forced a laugh, hoping to dispel the unease creeping in. "It's definitely not for us, right?" She didn't answer right away, and that pause was louder than any words she could have spoken. Finally, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said almost too quickly. "I was just wondering." That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that her curiosity wasn't as innocent as she wanted me to believe. In the weeks that followed, Alice seemed to grow closer to Sarah. They started having coffee together in the mornings, sometimes spending hours chatting in our backyard. I told myself it was just Alice being friendly. She'd always been the more social one, the kind of person who could make fast friends in any situation. But there were moments that felt off. Like the time I came home early from work to find Sarah in our kitchen, laughing with Alice like they'd known each other for years. Or the night Todd stopped by under the guise of borrowing a tool but stayed far longer than necessary, his conversation peppered with comments that felt oddly personal. I wanted to believe it was all harmless. I told myself I was overthinking, letting my discomfort from that dinner cloud my judgment. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, Alice brought it up again. "Don't you ever wonder if we're missing out?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "On what?" I asked, though I already knew where this was going. "On experiences, new things. People live their lives in so many different ways. Don't you think it's worth exploring, even just a little?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge. I stared at her, searching for the woman I thought I knew. "I'm happy with what we have," I said firmly. "Isn't that enough for you?" For a moment, she looked as though she might argue, but then she sighed and leaned back against the couch. "Of course it is," she said softly. "I was just curious, that's all." But her curiosity was like a spark in dry grass. It wouldn't take much for it to ignite into something uncontrollable. Alice's curiosity didn't fade. It only seemed to grow stronger with time. It was subtle at first, like a vine slowly wrapping itself around the walls of our life, invisible until it was too late. She began asking me hypothetical questions. "Do you think love can be shared with more than one person? What if people redefine fidelity for themselves? Would that still be wrong?" I brushed these off as intellectual musings, even though they left a sour taste in my mouth. "Why are you asking me this stuff, Alice?" I said one night after dinner, trying to sound lighthearted. "You planning to write a philosophy paper or something?" She smiled but didn't answer. And that silence, it said more than words ever could. Soon, it wasn't just questions. Alice's behavior started to shift in ways I couldn't ignore. She spent more time with Sarah. Long lunches, shopping trips, even late-night conversations on the porch while I sat inside pretending not to notice. Todd would occasionally join them, his presence always carrying a strange energy, as though he were in on a joke I wasn't privy to. One Saturday, I came home from running errands to find the three of them sitting in our living room, drinking wine and laughing. The atmosphere was electric, almost too lively. When I walked in, the laughter stopped, replaced by a silence that felt like it had waited. "John," Alice said, her tone a bit too bright. "You're back early." "Yeah," I replied, my eyes darting between Todd and Sarah. "Looks like I missed the party." Todd grinned, raising his glass. "You should join us next time. It's always a good time with Alice." His words felt loaded, though I couldn't say why. I forced a smile and excused myself to the kitchen, pretending to need water. From there, I could hear their conversation pick up again, quieter this time, as though I weren't meant to hear. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "What's going on with you and Sarah?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Alice turned to me, her expression carefully neutral. "What do you mean?" "You've been spending a lot of time with her. And Todd. It's just weird, Alice. I feel like I'm missing something." She sighed, sitting up and running her hands through her hair. "John, you're overthinking this. They're just friends. Really good friends. It's nice to have people to talk to here, especially since you're at work all day." Her explanation sounded reasonable, but the pit in my stomach didn't ease. "Just don't forget about us," I said, my voice quieter now. Alice leaned over, kissing my cheek. "I'd never forget about us," she whispered, but the way she said it felt more like a promise to herself than to me. As the weeks went on, her questions became less hypothetical. She started asking me directly how I felt about Todd and Sarah's lifestyle. "Do you think it's wrong?" she asked one evening as we washed dishes together. "Wrong for us, maybe," I replied, keeping my eyes on the plate in my hands. "But if it works for them, I guess it's their business." She didn't say anything, just nodded as though filing away my answer for later. The turning point came one night when Alice came home late from a girls' night with Sarah. She smelled faintly of wine and perfume, her cheeks flushed, her movements languid and deliberate. When I asked how her evening was, she just smiled and said, "Liberating." It was then I realized I wasn't imagining things. Alice was slipping away from me, one unspoken secret at a time. The tension between us finally reached its breaking point one Friday evening. Alice had spent the day with Sarah again, and when she came home, her mood was buoyant, almost euphoric. Meanwhile, I had been stewing in my own thoughts, trying to convince myself I wasn't imagining the growing distance between us. As she walked into the house, still laughing at some joke Sarah had apparently told, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Alice, we need to talk," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She stopped mid-step, her laughter fading as she looked at me. "About what?" "About this thing with Sarah and Todd. About you spending so much time with them. About these weird questions you keep asking me." Her smile dropped, replaced by a defensive edge. "We're just friends, John. Why are you making this into something it's not?" "Because it feels like something it's not," I snapped, standing up from the couch. "You've been acting different, Alice. Distant. And these what-if questions? They're not just innocent curiosity, are they?" She crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "You're overreacting. I'm allowed to have friends. I'm allowed to ask questions. Not everything has to mean something, John." "Then why does it feel like it does?" I shot back. "Why does it feel like you're considering something? Something you know I'd never agree to?" She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment as if gathering her patience. "Look, I'm not doing anything wrong. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just exploring ideas, okay? Trying to figure out what makes me happy." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What makes you happy? What about what makes us happy? Isn't that what a marriage is supposed to be about?" Her silence was deafening. She looked away, her arms still crossed, her posture rigid. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter but no less firm. "I don't want to fight about this. I'm tired, John. Can we just drop it?" But I couldn't drop it. Not this time. "No, we can't just drop it. Because I'm starting to feel like I don't know you anymore. Like the woman I married is disappearing, and I don't know what's replacing her." Her eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, I thought she might yell. But instead, she turned and walked away, heading upstairs without another word. The sound of the bedroom door closing echoed through the house, leaving me alone in the silence. That night, I slept on the couch, not because she asked me to, but because I couldn't bring myself to lie next to her, knowing that whatever was pulling us apart was only growing stronger. The days after our argument were filled with a cold, awkward silence. Alice avoided eye contact, her responses to my questions clipped and indifferent. It was as though she had put up a wall between us, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break through. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the television, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unfamiliar number. "Hey John, hope this isn't too forward, but I thought you should know what's been happening. A friend." Attached was a photo. My heart dropped as I opened it. The image was blurry, clearly taken in low light, but unmistakable. It was Alice and Sarah at a bar, their faces close, sharing a laugh that looked far more intimate than casual. My mind raced. Who had sent this? Why? And what was I supposed to do with it? The anger bubbled up before I could stop it. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to wait for Alice to volunteer them. When she came home later that night, I was ready. She walked through the door, her smile fading the moment she saw my expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting her bag down. I held up my phone. "This is what's wrong." Her face went pale as she stared at the screen. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and then she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "John, it's not what it looks like." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, really? Because it looks like you're sneaking around with Sarah behind my back. Care to explain how I'm wrong?" She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "We were just talking," she said finally, her voice defensive. "She's been helping me figure some things out." "Figure what out, Alice?" I snapped, standing up. "Whether or not you want to be married. Whether or not you want to cheat on me." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely hurt. "It's not like that," she said, her voice trembling. "I haven't done anything. I swear." "Then why does it feel like you have?" I shot back. "Why does it feel like you're keeping secrets from me, Alice? Like there's this whole other side of you I don't know anymore." She opened her mouth to respond, but then closed it again, as though unsure of what to say. Finally, she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she said softly. I feel like I'm losing myself, John. Like I'm stuck in this life that doesn't feel like mine anymore." Her words stunned me. I had expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even excuses. But this raw vulnerability, it threw me off balance. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice softer now. "Because I didn't know how," she admitted. "I didn't want to hurt you. I still don't." For a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. But then I remembered the photo, the secrecy, the unanswered questions. And I realized that no matter how much I loved Alice, I couldn't ignore the cracks in our relationship any longer. The morning after our confrontation, I woke up to find Alice already gone. Her side of the bed was cold, and a note sat on the kitchen counter. "I need some time to think. Don't wait up." "Alice." My chest tightened as I read those words. Time to think? About what? About us? About whether our marriage was worth saving. The questions swirled in my mind, and with each passing hour, the silence in the house grew heavier. I decided to clear my head and take a walk through the neighborhood. The crisp air was a welcome distraction, though every step seemed to lead me past reminders of Alice. Her laughter in the backyard, her voice echoing through the halls of our new home. As I rounded the corner near Todd and Sarah's house, I noticed their car in the driveway. I hesitated for a moment before continuing past, but just as I was about to turn back toward my street, I heard voices. Familiar voices. I stopped, my heart pounding. Peeking through the hedge that bordered their backyard, I saw them. Alice, Todd, and Sarah, sitting together on the patio, their heads close as they spoke in hushed tones. Alice looked animated, her hands gesturing as she talked, while Sarah leaned in, nodding intently. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the scene before me was enough to ignite a spark of fury. What was she doing here? Why hadn't she told me? And why did it feel like they were planning something that didn't include me? I turned and walked away, my mind racing. By the time I got home, I could barely sit still. I paced the living room, debating whether to confront her again or wait for her to come to me. Hours passed, and just as the sun began to set, Alice walked through the door. "Where were you?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She looked startled for a moment but quickly recovered. "I told you. I needed time to think." "With Todd and Sarah?" I demanded. "What exactly are you thinking about, Alice? Because it sure doesn't feel like it's our marriage." She froze, her face pale. "Were you spying on me?" "Don't turn this around on me," I snapped. "I'm not the one sneaking around and having secret meetings. What's going on? Alice? Just tell me the truth." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she took a deep breath and sat down on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Okay," she said finally. "You're right. There's something I need to tell you." My heart raced as I sat across from her, bracing myself for whatever she was about to say. "I've been thinking about us, about our marriage," she began, her voice trembling. "And I realized that I've been feeling trapped. Like there's this whole other side of me I've been ignoring because I was afraid of what it would mean for us." "What side?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "The side that wants more," she admitted. "More experiences, more freedom, more everything." The words hit me like a freight train. "So what? You want an open marriage? Is that it?" She looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I don't know," she said softly. "All I know is that I'm not happy, John. And I don't think I have been for a long time." Her confession left me reeling. I felt like the ground beneath me had given way, leaving me grasping for something, anything, to hold on to. But no matter how much I tried to make sense of it, one thing was clear. The woman I thought I knew was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Alice's confession lingered in the air like smoke, choking the space between us. She sat across from me, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped at her eyes. I wanted to be angry, wanted to yell, accuse, demand answers, but all I felt was a deep, aching sadness. How long have you felt this way? I asked finally, my voice quieter than I intended. She hesitated, biting her lip. I don't know. Maybe a year? Maybe longer. It's not about you, John. You're a good husband. I feel like I've been living someone else's life. Her words stung, each one like a tiny blade slicing into me. Someone else's life? I repeated, struggling to keep my composure. So what, our marriage? Our life together was just a mistake? No, she said quickly, her eyes wide. It wasn't a mistake. I love you, John. I really do. But loving you doesn't mean I don't feel incomplete. Incomplete. I echoed, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. And what, you think Todd and Sarah can help you fill that void? She flinched, her face flushing with guilt. They're just friends, she said weakly. Friends don't make you question your marriage. I shot back. Friends don't encourage you to betray the person who's stood by you for years. Her eyes filled with tears again, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she bowed her head, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of her emotions was too much to bear. I don't know what to do, she whispered. I don't want to lose you, John, but I also don't want to lose this part of me I've discovered. Her words left me speechless. This wasn't just about Todd and Sarah or some fleeting curiosity. This was about Alice's identity, about a version of her I'd never known, one that didn't fit into the life we'd built together. That night, we didn't speak again. She went to bed early, leaving me alone in the living room with my thoughts. I sat there for hours, replaying her words over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of how everything had unraveled so quickly. When I finally went upstairs, she was already asleep, or pretending to be. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her. She looked peaceful, almost like the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But I knew better now. The Alice lying in that bed was a stranger to me, and I had no idea if we could ever find our way back to each other. The days following Alice's confession were a blur of tension and avoidance. We moved through the house like ghosts, careful not to cross paths for too long, speaking only when necessary. It was as though the air between us had thickened, making every interaction feel heavy and suffocating. I threw myself into work, leaving the house early and coming home late, desperate for any excuse not to face the growing chasm in our relationship. But even at the office, I couldn't escape my thoughts. Alice's words echoed in my mind. I feel incomplete. One evening, I came home to find her in the kitchen, cooking dinner. It was an unusual sight. She hadn't cooked in weeks. The smell of roasted garlic and herbs filled the air, and for a moment, I let myself believe this was her way of making amends. Hey, I said cautiously as I set my bag down. She turned and smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I thought we could have dinner together tonight. Like we used to. I nodded, trying to match her tone. Sounds nice. We sat across from each other at the table, the meal beautifully plated. But the silence between us was unbearable, every bite tasting like regret. Finally, I set my fork down and broke the stillness. Alice, we can't keep doing this, pretending everything's fine when it's not. Her shoulders tensed, and she let out a shaky breath. I know, she admitted. I don't know how to fix this. Do you even want to? I asked, my voice quieter now. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I do, John. I just don't know if I can be the person you need me to be. Her honesty cut deeper than any lie ever could. And what about the person you need to be? Does that version of you even include me? She didn't answer right away, and the silence was louder than any response she could have given. Finally, she reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. I want to try, she said softly, but her words felt hollow, like an echo in an empty room. That weekend, Todd and Sarah invited us over for dinner. Alice seemed eager to accept, but I hesitated. The idea of sitting across from them, pretending everything was normal, made my stomach churn. Still, I agreed, hoping it might bring some clarity, or at least a distraction. Their house was warm and inviting, the table set with care, candles flickering in the center. Sarah greeted us with her usual charm, while Todd's grin felt a little too knowing, his eyes lingering on Alice in a way that made my skin crawl. As the evening progressed, the conversation drifted to relationships. Sarah spoke openly about their lifestyle, her words laced with an almost evangelical enthusiasm. "It's about trust," she said, her gaze flicking between Alice and me. "About letting go of jealousy and embracing freedom. It's not for everyone, but for us, it's been transformative." I could feel Alice watching me, her eyes searching for a reaction. But I kept my face neutral, refusing to give her, or them, the satisfaction. On the way home, the silence between us was deafening. When we pulled into the driveway, I finally turned to her. "Is this what you want, Alice? Is this what you think will make you happy?" She looked at me, her face pale in the dim light. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I can't stop thinking about it." Her words hung in the air as we sat there, neither of us willing to break the fragile silence. In that moment, I realized the cracks in our foundation weren't just growing. They were threatening to bring everything crashing down. It was Sunday afternoon when the call came. I was sitting on the couch, mindlessly flipping through TV channels, when my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. The message was simple, almost casual. "Hey John, just wanted to check in. How are you doing? Alice seemed a little distant last night. We're here if you want to talk." My stomach twisted. I had never liked Sarah, but this felt like an intrusion, a thinly veiled attempt to manipulate me into giving up control. I knew Alice had been spending more and more time with them, but to have Sarah reach out like this, as if she were some sort of confidant, it made my skin crawl. I sat there, staring at the screen, debating whether or not to respond. My instinct was to ignore it, to distance myself even further from the mess Alice had created. But something in me, something deep down, the part of me that still cared for Alice, that still loved her, made me type out a response. "I'm fine, thanks. Just trying to figure things out." Seconds passed before her reply came. "We all go through moments like this. Just remember you're not alone. We're here for you." That was it. That was when I snapped. It wasn't the words themselves, but the fact that Sarah was playing this role as some kind of emotional savior for me, as if she had any right to guide me through this. She wasn't the one stuck in a marriage on the edge of collapse. She wasn't the one who had to confront the woman he loved about what she'd become. I stood up abruptly, pacing around the living room, trying to shake the anger that was building inside me. I needed answers. I needed to understand why Alice had become so tangled up in this new world. This world that felt foreign and suffocating to me. When Alice came home later that evening, I was waiting for her in the living room. She looked surprised to see me there, sitting in the dim light, my expression unreadable. "John, you're home early. What's going on?" "Sit down," I said, my voice low but firm. She did, slowly, looking at me with a mix of caution and curiosity. "I got a text from Sarah today," I said, my eyes locking onto hers. "She checked in on me, told me I wasn't alone, that she and Todd are here for me." Alice stiffened, her lips pressing together in an almost imperceptible line. "John, that's—" "No," I interrupted, standing up. "You don't get to say that's nothing. You don't get to pretend this isn't happening." Her eyes darted away, avoiding my gaze. I could feel her pulling further away, as though she were trying to hide behind some invisible wall. "Alice, I need to know something," I continued, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "Are you in this with me? Or are you in this with them? Because it's clear to me now that there's something between you and them, something I'm not a part of." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, her eyes filled with tears, and I saw the mask she'd been wearing start to crack. "I don't know anymore, John," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought I did. I thought I could make this work. But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I even want to anymore." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I staggered back, my mind racing. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I loved her enough we could work through this. But Alice had already made up her mind. She had already chosen her path, and I was just the bystander. "I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice breaking. I can't keep pretending I'm okay with this. I don't want to live in this half-life anymore. Alice looked at me, her face pale, tears streaking down her cheeks. John, please, she begged, reaching out for me. Don't leave me. I need you. I need us. But it was too late. I had already made my decision. I'm sorry, Alice, I said, shaking my head. I can't stay in a relationship that's already fallen apart. You've already made your choice. And so have I. And with that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing on the couch behind me. The door closed softly behind me, but the sound felt deafening. The days after I left Alice were a blur. I moved into a small apartment not far from the house. It was sterile, quiet, everything that our home had once been, but now it felt like a distant memory. The walls of the apartment were bare, no pictures, no mementos. It was just me and the weight of my decision. Alice tried to contact me several times. Texts, phone calls, even a few desperate voicemails. But I didn't pick up. Couldn't. I needed space. Space to think, to breathe, to be alone with the wreckage that our marriage had become. I told myself I was fine. I told myself that I was strong, that I could handle this. But deep down, I knew it was a lie. I missed Alice. I missed the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman I thought I knew, the woman who had promised me forever. But somewhere along the way, that woman had disappeared, replaced by someone I couldn't recognize. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon that she finally showed up at my apartment. There was no warning, no heads up, just a knock on the door. When I opened it, there she was, drenched, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes red from crying. John, she whispered, her voice breaking. Can we talk? I stepped back, my heart clenching at the sight of her, but I didn't let her in. Couldn't. Alice, we've talked enough, I said, my voice harsh. There's nothing left to say. Please, she begged, her voice desperate. I made a mistake. I know I've hurt you, and I'm so sorry, but I don't want to lose you. I can't imagine my life without you. For a moment I wavered. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that maybe, just maybe, things could go back to how they were. But deep down, I knew I could never trust her again. Not after everything that had happened. I can't, Alice, I said, my voice steady but firm. I can't keep being your backup plan. I can't keep pretending that everything's going to magically fix itself. You've made your choice. You've been clear about what you want, and I just can't be a part of that. She stepped back, the tears spilling down her cheeks. I never meant to hurt you, John. I never meant for any of this to happen. But it did, I said, my chest tight with emotion. And now we both have to live with the consequences. She nodded, looking broken. I don't know who I am without you, John. But I can't change who I've become either. Her words stung more than I could have anticipated. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger. Only a hollow sadness that mirrored my own. We had both lost something precious. And there was no going back. Alice, I'll always love you, I said softly, the words leaving my lips with a finality that I could never take back. But we're not the same anymore. We've both changed. And I have to let you go. She nodded again, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I understand, she whispered, turning to walk away. And as she left, I felt a weight lift from my chest. It wasn't relief exactly, more like resignation. I had done the right thing, but the pain was still there, gnawing at me. The weeks that followed felt like a haze. I kept busy, throwing myself into work and avoiding the empty spaces that used to be filled with Alice. The apartment became my refuge, my safe space, but it was hard to ignore the loneliness that crept in at night. The silence felt louder than anything. I didn't hear from Alice again for a while. After that final conversation, I thought she might try to reach out, but the calls, the messages all stopped. And for a moment it felt like maybe this was for the best. Maybe we had both needed the space to truly realize what we had lost, what we had become. But then, one afternoon, there it was, a letter. I hadn't been expecting it. Came in a simple envelope with no return address, no clue as to where it had come from. But I knew immediately who it was from. I sat down at the kitchen table and slowly opened it, my hands trembling as I unfolded the letter. The handwriting was familiar, though it looked shaky, as though written in haste. John, it began. I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us. About everything that's happened. And I don't know if I can fix the mistakes I've made, but I want to try. I know I've hurt you, and I know I've lost your trust. But please, know that I never wanted to hurt you. I just lost my way. I read the letter through twice, each word pulling at something deep inside me. Part of me wanted to respond, wanted to go back to her, to salvage something of the woman I had loved. But the other part of me, the part that had been broken by everything, knew that I couldn't. The letter went on to explain that she had been seeing a therapist, that she was trying to figure out who she was, apart from everything that had happened. She said she missed me, that she would always love me, and that maybe someday we could find a way to rebuild what had been lost. But those words, though they had the weight of sincerity, felt too little, too late. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. I was just numb. The desire to rebuild, to go back to the way things had been, had faded long ago. That night, I sat with the letter in my hands, staring out the window at the city lights below. I had spent so much time trying to piece together the fragments of our life, the broken moments that had once seemed so perfect. But the truth was, there was no going back. We were two different people now, living two different lives. I set the letter down, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer of my nightstand. I knew I would never respond. Not because I didn't care, but because I had to let her go. For both of us. Time has a funny way of dulling the sharp edges of pain, but it doesn't erase it entirely. For weeks, I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, trying to rebuild the life I had lost. I threw myself into my routine, work, gym, errands, and for the most part it worked. There were days when the loneliness felt overwhelming, but there were fewer and fewer of those as time passed. I started seeing a therapist, not because I felt like I was broken, but because I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me navigate the tangled mess of emotions that I was still struggling to understand. My therapist, Mark, was a quiet, no-nonsense guy. He didn't try to sugarcoat things or offer me easy solutions. He just listened, and that made all the difference. John, Mark said one session, his voice calm but firm, you can't fix everything. What you're going through right now, it's not something that can be healed overnight. But you can start to heal little by little by accepting that what happened was out of your control. And by accepting that it's okay to let go. Letting go. Those two words seem so simple, yet they were the hardest thing for me to do. For so long, I had fought to hold on to what I thought was my perfect life. But the truth was, it was never perfect. Not really. One evening, I found myself driving past our old neighborhood. The house that Alice and I had shared was still there, standing tall and quiet. I could see the lights on in the windows, the silhouettes of people moving behind the curtains. It was strange to think that someone else might be living there now. Someone else was making new memories in a place that had once felt like the center of my world. I didn't stop, couldn't. But as I drove away, I felt a shift in me. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was just moving on. The months passed, and eventually I found myself dating again. It was awkward at first. The idea of opening myself up to someone else after everything I had been through felt foreign, like a distant dream. But there was a woman named Emily, a quiet, thoughtful woman I had met at a friend's party. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something. Not the same kind of love I had once felt for Alice, but something new, something fresh. Emily was patient with me. She didn't try to rush things or push me to move faster than I was ready to. She allowed me to go at my own pace, to find my footing again. And little by little, I found that I was able to open up to her, to share parts of myself that I hadn't thought were accessible anymore. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since the divorce, I felt something like hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find happiness again. Not the happiness I once had, but something different, something that was mine alone. And so life moved on. Not the way I had planned it, not the way I had imagined it, but in its own way it moved forward. It's strange how life can push you forward without you even realizing it. One day, you're stuck in the past, questioning every decision, every step that led to this point. And the next, you wake up and find yourself somewhere new, emotionally, mentally, and sometimes even physically. The first time I saw Alice again, I almost didn't recognize her. It was at a coffee shop in town, one of those places I used to frequent with her when everything was still normal. I had just finished my shift and was grabbing a cup of coffee before heading home. I walked in, distracted, scrolling through my phone, when I almost bumped into someone. John. I looked up, startled, and there she was, Alice, standing in front of me, her hair longer than it used to be, her face softer, like she hadn't been wearing the weight of guilt I'd seen when we last spoke. She had changed, she seemed lighter, and for a second, I wondered if I had imagined the years of tension and heartbreak we had gone through. But no, I hadn't imagined it. Couldn't. Hi, she said, her voice cautious but not as uncertain as I expected. I didn't know you came here anymore. I nodded, trying to keep my composure. Yeah, I guess I didn't either. We both stood there for a few seconds, an awkward silence hanging between us. It was like two strangers meeting in the middle of a shared past. I wasn't sure if it was her or me who broke the silence first, but it didn't matter. I'm glad to see you're doing okay, she said quietly. You look good, John. It was hard to find the right words. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to navigate this moment. After everything we'd been through, I wasn't sure how to respond. But instead of anger, instead of the bitterness I thought would be there was just calm. Yeah, I said, offering a small smile. I'm doing all right. We stood there for a while, neither of us knowing quite what to say next. But eventually, Alice broke the silence again. I've been seeing someone, she said. A therapist. I'm working on myself, John. I think I've figured out a lot of things I didn't understand before. The words stung a little, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I couldn't help but wonder if this was the person she was always meant to be. The person I had wanted her to be, but couldn't bring out of her. That's good, I replied, my voice steady. I'm glad you're finding your way. Another silence fell between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. It was a moment of recognition, of acceptance. We both knew things would never go back to the way they were, but we also knew that we had done the best we could at the time. We were simply different now. I should go, Alice said finally, breaking the stillness. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything, John. I really am. I met her eyes, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel angry. I know, I said softly. I know. As she walked out of the cafe, I stood there for a while, watching her leave, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, and a quiet understanding that we had both made peace with what had happened. We had both moved on. And as I walked back to my car, I felt lighter. Not because I had forgiven her, not because everything was suddenly okay, but because I had finally let go. Let go of the anger, the resentment, the weight of our past. I didn't need closure. I didn't need a final apology. I just needed to know that I was going to be okay. And I was. It's funny how life comes full circle when you least expect it. A year had passed since I last saw Alice, since that coffee shop meeting that had been both an end and a beginning. I had grown so much since then. The pain had faded, but the lessons from my marriage, lessons that I never would have asked for, stayed with me. They shaped me, helped me redefine who I was and what I wanted out of life. I had settled into a new rhythm, one that didn't revolve around the past, but one that allowed me to move forward. Emily and I had become closer, our relationship blossoming in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. With Emily, I learned that love doesn't have to be all-consuming to be meaningful. It just has to be real. But there were still days when the past would find its way back to me. Small things. Seeing a house that looked like ours, hearing a song that reminded me of Alice, even driving down a familiar street, would bring memories flooding back. And on those days I would take a deep breath, remember how far I had come, and remind myself that I was stronger than I had ever known. It was one Friday evening, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment, sipping a cold beer and watching the city lights flicker in the distance, that I realized just how much I had changed. Emily was inside, preparing dinner. We had plans to go to a local art gallery later, something we both enjoyed. The phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I pulled it out and saw that it was a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was a simple text. "Hey John, it's Sarah. Can we talk? It's about Alice." For a split second, my stomach dropped. I hadn't heard from Sarah in months, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. After everything with Alice, the last thing I needed was to get pulled back into that world. But there was something about the message that made me pause. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and then tapped out a reply. "What's going on? What about Alice?" The response came quickly. "She's been struggling. She's asking about you, John. She says she wants to talk to you, but she's afraid. I think she's finally realizing what she lost." I stared at the message for a while, the weight of it sinking in. Part of me felt sympathy, part of me felt indifference. But then I thought about how far I had come, how much stronger I had become, and I knew I couldn't let the past drag me back down. I sent one last message. "Tell her I'm sorry, but I'm not going back. I've moved on. I hope she finds peace, but I'm not the one to give it to her." I hit send, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. I stood up and walked inside, where Emily was setting the table. Her smile when she saw me was enough to remind me that I was exactly where I needed to be. I had my life, my future, in front of me. I sat down across from her and reached for her hand. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft, filled with concern. I nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Yeah, everything's fine." And for the first time in a long time, I truly believed it. As I reflect on everything that has happened, the pain, the loss, the healing, it all feels like a distant memory now. A story I had to live through in order to become the person I am today. The truth is, when you go through something like I did, you come out the other side with a stronger understanding of yourself. You realize that you can love someone and still let them go when it's time. That true love isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to set each other free. So here I am, years later, looking at my life with a sense of peace. The past doesn't define me anymore. It's part of my story, but it's not the whole story. If you've ever been in a situation where you thought you couldn't move on, where the pain seemed unbearable, I want you to know this. You can. It might not be easy. It might not happen overnight, but you will find your way. You'll find the strength you never knew you had, and you'll come out stronger for it. If this story resonated with you, or if you've gone through something similar, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, share your story, because we're all in this together. And don't forget to subscribe so you can keep following my journey. Life has a funny way of surprising us, and who knows what's next. Thanks for watching.